Caused lots of damage, not only to the world but also to the region, especially to Turkey. And regarding that issue, on behalf of the Top Economics and Technology University, Department of Political Science and International Relations, I'd like to say welcome to all of you in person and also online guests who watch us through the social media platforms. We care about, as a department, we care about the extracurricular activities and also ambassadors, professors abroad, and also practitioners, scholars are empowering our academic curriculum. On behalf of the department, I'd like to say thank you to all of them. And now we are going to have a panel on Syria with two experienced diplomats and academics. I'd like to invite my colleague Şaban Kardeş moderating that event. Şaban, floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. At this point in life, I need to use these glasses. Welcome to all of you again on behalf of our universal department. As Harun mentioned, we are trying to enhance the quality of our education through such extracurricular activities. As we remember, before the COVID times, we used to organize several events, but it got interrupted. So now, with the spring, we are warming up and we are also getting back to the stage. We have got several online events, but now this event is our first trial hybrid event in the sense that we have both in person and online audiences to listen. And today we are privileged to be supported by the French Institute of Anatolian Studies in Istanbul. Dr. Bayram was kind enough to offer this collaboration opportunity. Today, as Harun mentioned, actually we are at a very meaningful day, the turn of the springtime, but also the so-called Arab Spring. And we are hosting two speakers who have had, in a sense, very much first-hand observations of this historic event, as scholar, as practitioner, as a diplomat. And we will try to discuss today the Arab Spring and its implications for the region from both French and Turkish perspectives. Our speakers are, in this sense, recovering diplomats to some extent. The Turkish ambassador, Önhon, at the time he was posted in Syria. Now he is retired from the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but he has been actively contributing to policy debates through his publications. He recently published a book on Syria, but beyond that, he has been also actively contributing to the work of different think tanks, joining the public discussions, and we are very privileged that he is able to join us today to offer a Turkish perspective from a first-hand point of view. Our second speaker, Professor Jean-Pierre Filiu, is from SciencesPo in Paris, and he's also a former diplomat. And it turned out that both Professor Filiu and Ambassador Önhon at the same time served in Damascus as young diplomats. They are still young. At the time, they were representing their countries in the capacity of deputy chief of mission. Again, a very historic moment during the Turkey-Syria crisis, which led to the expulsion of Ömer out of Syria. So, in that sense, we are very privileged. And he has been a good scholar of the Middle Eastern politics. He has published quite important books, and some of his books have been also translated into Turkish as well, for those who are interested. And he has been in Turkey as part of the program organized by the French Institute in Istanbul. He has attended some events in Istanbul as well. He has been in talks there. Now he also made a kind of time to make a day of his trip to Ankara, and today we are him and Ambassador Önhon together. With these long introductions, I start here. And then first, let me invite Professor Filiu. We have the floor, and then we will go to Ambassador Önhon. For the colleagues' sake, to make the space less congested, we will invite the speakers one by one. And for the Q&A, we will invite them to the podium, and then in the Q&A session, we will be interested in hearing your reactions, questions, and further comments. Please.
Thank you so much. It's really a privilege and an honor for me being here, speaking to you, whether in this room or online. I really want to thank warmly everybody who made this possible. Of course, Professor Haldun Yalchinkaya and Shaban Kardash, the French ambassador, Ömer, who honored me and us with his presence this morning, and by Ömer, who from the Institute has organized a road trip from Istanbul to Ankara. It's also a very fortunate opportunity for me to meet again Önhon. So we are still young at heart and in mind. At that time, we were 98 diplomats in the previous part of our career, very special moments of the Turkish-Syrian, Turkish-French, and Syrian-French relationship. As I was recalling, it may seem a long time ago, but at that time, France was the best friend of Turkey in Europe, and France was the best friend of Syria in Europe, 98. So today, in order to offer this French perspective, first I have to insist on the fact that I will deliver this perspective from my personal point of view. Absolutely no official capacity. Very important. And I will take, in fact, already some time because I drink a lot. And as a historian, I will try to make a parallel between the French experience in Syria during the mandate and the Russian experience now in Syria, because I think in both instances, even though the United Nations mandate of Russia and Syria is not official, it's a reality, and we all see how it brings new development in the world and outside of the Middle East, while, of course, as you know, the French mandate by the League of Nations of Syria was an official one, but still parallels have to be drawn. Because in 1920s, the Syrian people, and more generally, the Arab revolutionary under the King Faisal, were defeated by the French, whereas they sided with the Allies, with the French and the British during the First World War against the Ottoman Empire and Germany. So the paradox is that after the famous Sèvres Treaty and 3 years later, through the Revolutionary War, the Lausanne Treaty, the Turkish people fulfilled their right to self-determination, while the Syrian people were deprived of the same right of self-determination because of the imposition of the French mandate in 1920. And when you are serving as a French diplomat in Syria, you know it pretty well, because the very office of Witness was the former palace of King Faisal during the so-called Arab Treaty, which, by the way, was a constitutional with specific guarantees and protection for minorities. All this was erased by the French, who established a mandate in Syria, signed the League of Nations, and that they controlled because the Americans had decided that nothing to do with this nation. So the British and the French were left free to carve out the Middle East. I insist on the fact that it was not on the SciencesPo line. The SciencesPo agreement was never implemented. It was something. So not only did the French impose this mandate, but they decided to carve up Syria into various entities. Now you hear a lot about how sectarianism is a fatality in Syria. Well, there was never an Alawite state until the French mandate in 1920. There was a Druze entity, but never a Druze state. Then you have the government of Aleppo, government of Damascus. Of course, Lebanon was taken out of the way. The Hatay of Sanjak was given special status. Same with the Kurds and the Syrian in the Syrian, which means that the divide and rule policy of the French mandate was essential in order to create the contradictions that we see today as innate to the Syrian society. They were built. And in fact, in 1925, what the French called the Jews revolt was in fact a nationalist uprising, exactly like the 2011 uprising. And it started in part of Syria, the Jebel Rus, that was supposed to be privileged to sectarian prejudice. In fact, that was the heartbeat of the Syrian revolutionary offensive, including all the various denomination, parties, communities, despite this divide of the French. But what is even more striking, and sometimes we historians have some kind of vertigo, is that when the uprising reached Damascus, it was in the Ghouta that the uprising was the strongest. And the very areas that were bombed repeatedly by the French in 1925-1926 were the ones that were targeted by the gas bombing of 2000. Encore, sanctuaries for women guerrillas, and now it was local suburbs of Damascus that were bombed in 2006. So you have this incredible echo, and the way that while France was being criticized as a group of nations, it was organizing elections that were, of course, totally the same way Assad has repeatedly justified the Russian invaded Syria, organized elections that are absolutely no. And this is when the now standard revolutionary flag of Syria with 3 stars was raised for the first time. Why 3 stars? Because 3 stars for the nationalist Syrians meant Damascus, Aleppo, and anywhere else in Syria that wanted to join the Syrian United Republic against the French. So this is the same flag that was raised by the revolution. So I do see a continuity in the struggle for self-determination. That, of course, was frustrated despite a historical opportunity, signing of between France and Syria in 1936 under the Popular Front. But when the right wing came back to power, they decided to abort this treaty and instead sign the treaty with Turkey that eventually ended up with the Sanjak Agreement to Turkey. Anyway, Syria became formally independent in 1943, but was still under French domination until 1945. But remember that Syria was the first item on the nascent United Nations in San Francisco because of the crisis between the French who didn't want to abandon Syria and the bombing of Damascus under the very orders of General de Gaulle, the liberator of France. So, as you see, the continuity of the struggle for self-determination is key to understand what happened again different. But I think it's still the same struggle that went on. Because the elite, the nationalist elite that took power after the French eventually created Eid al-Jabhat, it's a national holiday, it's a on the evacuation of French in 1966 paper. Those elites, instead of having been empowered by the French in order to build a strong Syria, were absolutely exhausted by the attrition war that French had waged against us during the whole mandate of the occupation. And therefore, they were not strong enough to resist the first coup in the long history of Arab coups that happened to take place in Syria in 1949. And Hosni, the then chief of staff who turned against the Republican regime, was the first one to change the nature of the regime. Before you had coups in Iraq, but he didn't change the nature of the monarchy. In Syria, for the first time, a military junta that had been defeated by Israel turned against its own institution and changed the regime. It was very unstable, about 3 coups in less than a year, some bloody, some blank, and that is because of the vitality of the Syrian democratic and reformist and pluralistic structure. It took nearly 50 years for the phenomenon that deprived our people of the right to self-determination in other Arab dictatorships. It took 15 years to do that in Syria. 15 years, there was a coup, establishment of one institution, 3 years of Egyptian occupation from 1958 to 1961, under the slogan of the Syrian, the United Arab Republic, which is when the now flag of Syria was invented with 2 stars. The 2 stars meaning Syria and Egypt. You have very few countries in the world whose flag is denying the national identity. This is the case of the Syrian flag, because the 2 stars in Syria was under the rule of the Syrian or the United Arab Republic, de facto occupied by the Egyptian army and security services. This occupation was defeated. There was a new cycle of trouble, and eventually, in 1963, the Baas party to power, and we established the 2 stars flag. But for the Syrian, don't say Egypt and Syria. The 2 stars is intelligence services that are looking at you everywhere and watching you everywhere. Fortunately for the Syrians, there's some more left in their tragedy. So now you have the Baas power. And in 1970, Hafez al-Assad took full and absolute power. How did he do that? By sacrificing part of his army during the Black September crisis in Jordan. Again, if you think that somebody is a head of state, he should care for his own army, but if he is a specialist of coup, he doesn't care, because it was the last of a series of 6, 7, 8 coups in only a few years. And he sacrificed the army in order to take power again. So from then on, you have to understand that what is often understood, especially in international relations, as the rationality of a state, is not relevant in Syria. We're talking about the rationality of a regime, and the regime is ready enough just to the past 11 years to destroy his own country, to sacrifice his own people in order to remain as a regime in power. So you have the first dynasty, dictatorial dynasty, under a republican regime in Iraq. Others have tried, all of them failed. Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, they all failed. The only one that succeeded was Hafez al-Assad with Bashar. Ömer myself were posted in Damascus in 1998. I'm sure I received the way I was receiving on a regular basis cables saying, who will come after Hafez? And everybody had wild scenarios, but we in Damascus, we knew that Bashar would be the guy. Everything was prepared. There would be no alternative. And it was the case. And so Bashar, like all heir, is much worse than the founder of the regime. Because the founder of the regime had to fight to get power. Bashar inherited not only the regime, but inherited Syria and the Syrians. For him, they are his personal property. So the idea that he could make any concession, any reform, is absolutely out of his mind. Syria is Soviet Assad. It's the Assad Syria. And you have to know that the standard slogan of the Assad supporters is Ilal Abad, for eternity. It's not lifelong. I even heard in the last meeting, Ilal Abad Wama Ba'du, for eternity and even after eternity. So just to give you an idea that people who think you can send and voice, discuss this or that, absolutely disconnected with this shocking reality. So I must admit also that when in 11 years ago, when Syrian people took to the street with the three-star flag, I was, of course, moved by admiration for the courage, because they were risking their life. But I was also very surprised because the extent of repression was, in my mind, and the vision of many specialists, forbidding this kind of development. But they went through. They went through with one major contribution, which was non-violence, because non-violence would be successful like in Egypt, and a major drawback, which was non-violence, which means that because they have not organized how they would eventually fall back on armed struggle, they were not ready for this military option, while the regime was, and was again played by the French during the mandate, the divide and rule, very successfully, including with Jews, but you know all that better than me. So that's when the Russian mandate started to take hold on Syria. Why the Russian mandate? First, because, as I coined in a recent chronicle in the French newspaper, you have to understand about Vladimir Assad and Bashar Putin. They have the same mindset, the same. Both of them inherited the system. Vladimir Putin didn't rise to power because of his talent and genius. He was named by Boris Yeltsin as a successor. Both are coming from Khabarovsk intelligence background. That means that for them, everything is about manipulation. It's not about people. People don't exist. People are manipulated by Mossad, CIA, Saudi intelligence. They don't believe in people. Everything is about manipulation. So their enemies are terrorists or Nazis, like Putin says about the Ukraine right now, and they have to be annihilated. There's absolutely no question about negotiating anything. And the third thing, of course, is that they are both running a mafia system. A mafia system with barons of patrons, say here, that are interested in drug dealing, car dealing, as we see there, and they are both in importing ports. Exporting and importing ports. So you have to control the sugar, same in Russia. So they have to take care, they are in fact the leader of the union of this mafia syndicate. So the syndicate is operating by ransacking and plundering the country and the people. So there is no private property. Anything a Syrian or Russian own could end up in the end of Putin or Bashar's protection, including family members or cars. You have the musharaka, the participation. They come to you, a nice structure. Just give us 40%, we'll give you 60%. It's the same in Russia. So those two systems are similar. And the mindset of Putin and Assad was the big mistake was not to understand it from the beginning that the unconditional support of Putin to Assad was ready to go also, and we saw it. And basically, let's call it because Obama has many talents, it's far brighter than me, but he doesn't know a lot about the tragedy of history as a tragedy. He always believed in it. And so he had this vision of the nuclear deal with Iran, and everything was had to follow according to this targeting. And we had to get along with the Russians, and for him, Syria, all this Arab uprising, all this mess, all these people in the street with not one. Oh, when the PKK came, then it was perfect. Iraqi, officers. That was the Syrian revolution of it. That was in Aleppo. It was a big mess. But by the way, they were winning. It was a big mess, but they were winning. They were winning. Because it was exactly because they had not this classical military culture that they could win in a standard battle like Aleppo. This was half of the city and for more than 4 years. And so that's when slowly, Russia started to establish its de facto UN mandate on Syria. Why? First was the veto power. Again, you see the relevance of this comparison with the current Ukraine crisis. That forced de facto all the UN agencies to try and placate Russia to be able to operate in Syria. That means that nobody from the UN system could operate in Syria without the Russian approval. And it transcended very far because all hospitals, because the only hospitals that were not owned by the Russians were the ones who didn't give their coordinates to the UN. All the other ones. That means the UN informed the Russians of the coordinates supposedly to avoid their bombings, and that made them targets. The ones that didn't give the coordinates were spared. So you imagine the diversity. Same with humanitarian corridors and so on. And it went on in 2015, because it's a man of his word, he has to believe what he says. He came to the General Assembly of the UN, and he started his global war on terror, his own global war. In 2002, it was from the same rostrum as the UN that George W. Bush had started this global war on terror. But nobody took notice because at that time, because of ISIS, all that, Daesh, they didn't understand that Putin was talking about something far bigger, that he was talking in fact about a global war on support of the regime against the people, and that Syria would be the crux of this global war. And in fact, by supporting and conditioning, by intervening, while the West, France, and the others were taking care of ISIS, he could take care of the Syrian opposition, bombing it, erasing it, under the name of reconciliation. The Orwellian philosophy of Putin is impressive. Reconciliation. Reconciliation means erasing, expelling, and taking control. And slowly. And he got, like the French mandate, he got extraterritorial privileges for his bases in Tartus, now for his air base in Armenia, for his own military police. Now, like at the time of the French, if a Syrian has a problem with local authorities, he turns to the Russian military police. There's the arbitration entity. So we have this mandate is not supposed to develop into something. And we see that the Russians were unable either to trigger some kind of reconstruction. The only things they could do is give Kadyrov and the Chechen mafia blanket contracts in Aleppo for luxury hotels and some prostitution networks. Okay, That didn't work. They don't know how to reconstruct. And by the way, Assad doesn't want to reconstruct. If Assad destroyed half of his country and expelled more than half of his population, he doesn't want them back. This is exactly what he wanted. He wanted this critical mass. He wanted the middle class to disappear because it was the main threat to his own regime. So the Russian mandate, but certainly the Russian mandate is about destruction. It's not about construction. But at the same time, from Syria, he built literally Russian credibility to act as a power playing over his weight worldwide because of what he did in Syria. And of course, in connection with all the Arab regimes, dictatorial regimes in the region, but also outside. And there is a direct connection between 2013 crisis, the fact that the red lines were not implemented by Obama, and the annexation of Crimea a few months later, that we all know now triggered the crisis. So I will just end up by saying that yes, there is today a de facto Russian mandate in Syria, and we should apprehend all the consequences of such reality. But the main difference with the French mandate was that the French didn't expel such a significant part of the local population first, and they didn't trigger from Syria an international crisis of the magnitude of the current Ukrainian crisis. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. I would first like to thank Şaban and Haldun Hojas and Director Güven Sak and Torpen Etu and the French Embassy. And it's really a big pleasure, great pleasure for me to see Jean-Pierre here after so many years. We were in Damascus, as he said, in 1998. Well, I was there from 1998 to 2000 for the first time. And it's very nice to have you here. And I was very educated really by what you said. And I have to say, I agree with almost everything that you have said. I think this was a very fair description of the psychology in Syria. And I think it was an excellent way of introducing a background political setting in Syria. I will try to be brief, and I base my presentation on three main groups. One of them is to lay the political background in the region. The second one is Turkey's place in all that, and the third one, I think, specifically what goes on in Syria and how we regard the crisis in Syria. Now, in the way of background, I think we have to look at the region and see the main elements which really have an effect on political and other developments in the Middle East. Now, one of them is the actors, and the actors, the local actors are Arabs, Iranians, Israelis, and the Turks. This has been so for very many centuries. And the second element, I think, is the sectarian divide, which is really very important and at the heart of the matter in many ways. The sectarian divide, meaning, of course, the Shia and Sunni conflict, which has been going on for centuries now. The third element, which I really attach importance, is the decades-long struggle between Arab nationalism, which has found its form in Baathism, and political Islam, which is nowadays represented by the Muslim Brotherhood or the Ikhwan Muslimin. Now, when the Arab Spring started, I thought this was an explosion of accumulation of so many things in the region, ranging from poverty to unequal distribution of wealth, and so many things, humiliation inside and out, and so many things. Plus, and I think I'm saying this more louder nowadays, quite a bit of outside interference to shape the developments in the region. I mean, whether it was the outside interference which started the Arab Spring, or whether outside interference came in to take advantage of what the people of the region by themselves started. These were the main elements which really put the Arab Spring on table in the Middle East. Now, the advantage of having lived through this process is, of course, you turn back and you can say, well, I knew that this was what I always told, and so on. I mean, some part of it may not be true, but in any case, we can look back and we can make judgments. Now, looking back from where it started to where it came to, where it started from and where it came to, I would say I will make the following conclusions. First of all, I think it's very important to define the Arab Spring. I mean, what people thought Arab Spring was. Was it bringing the European type of democracy to the Middle East, or was it more power to the people, but in a Middle Eastern way, in an Oriental way? I don't know. I mean, there are many definitions of that, but when we look at what happened in the past 11 years since the Arab Spring started, I would say not much has changed, if not for the worse. I mean, that's what we see today. There are still ongoing crises and ongoing armed conflicts. The second thing is, as of today, there are much more relations in the region than before the Arab Spring started. And the most visible example of this is, of course, the Abraham Accords. I mean, whereas Israel had relations with only Egypt and Jordan, today they have relations with official diplomatic relations with 6 Middle Eastern countries, plus informal relations on an informal basis with, I would say, almost all the countries in the region. A third thing is, today we have much more gulf in both regional and international politics. I mean, clearly, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are much more at the forefront of the regional and international policies. I mean, they can affect the way things are going. The fourth thing is, we have a very new generation of leaders who are very different than their forefathers, than their fathers, than their grandfathers. I mean, they are much more into the field and much more willing to take risks and much more willing to make some concrete achievements and affect the ways that things move. Another factor is the status of the great powers, let's say, in the Middle East. Now, the first one is, of course, the United States of America. There is talk about, I mean, there is a wide perception that the United States is withdrawing from the region. I don't think so. The United States will never, I think, withdraw from the region. But what they are doing is they are reorganizing and recalibrating. But that's a global thing that they are doing, not only, it doesn't pertain only to the Middle East. So the United States is in the Middle East, will continue to stay in the Middle East, but I think in a different way. Now, Russia is too scary, and I really agree with everything that you have, everything and more actually, that you have said about Russia. Russia is too scary, and they don't have much to offer really in economic terms, but they are rather desirable, or they are in with their fire power and also Security Council protection. Now, if you look at Russia, in addition to what you said, Jean-Pierre, I think the way that they act is really a mafia-like manner. But the way that they are acting today is not something new. I mean, we are talking about centuries-old military culture. Go back to, you can go back centuries, but I did not go back so far. Just start from the 1860s, for example, the Russian war in Caucasia and the expulsion of the people of Caucasia is really almost exactly what is happening today, in both in objectives and strategy. Then in Chechnya in 1990s, for example, we saw the same trend. We saw the same thing in Syria. We saw the same thing. We are seeing the same thing now in Ukraine. Now, in Russian military culture, there is no such thing called collateral damage. Everything moving and everything which breathes, I think, is a legitimate target. I mean, this is what I see when I look at what's happening on the ground, and targeting civilian places such as marketplaces, hospitals, schools is a deliberate tactic. I mean, it's a tactic to frighten off people and to make the inhabitants of the local inhabitants rise against the fighters who are fighting on their behalf, or so they claim. So what we see in Russia is very scary. I mean, this is maybe they may think themselves of as power projecting its strength on the ground, but actually they are fighting very many countries. So that's just a side comment. And then the third power is China, of course, but as is very clear, China is very much present in the Middle East, but it's like a German submarine. They are nowhere to be seen, and they are very much engaged in the economic life. I mean, they are also conducting kind of a war, but the war is being done in a very nice way, you know, being profitable to locals also. Now, at the end of that, I would say, yes, there are crises, there is a war, there are several wars going on, but then even this situation on the ground gives a chance for opportunities. And I would say it is time for countries of region to take matters in their hands and to come up with a regional ownership. Of course, with outside support in a way, but regional ownership, I would say, is the main element. Now, where is Turkey on in all that? To go back a little bit, in 1950s, Turkey was not very popular in the region, in the Middle East. And Turkey was not really very interested in the region, actually. Two reasons for that. One of them is becoming a member of NATO in 1952, under the Cold War conditions, of course, and the strong Western orientation. So Turkey's direction was really to integrate with the West, and it didn't have much time to get involved with what was going on in the Middle East. And the only perspective, or the major perspective, that Turkey had was Cold War conditions. I mean, Turkey was in the Middle East or next to the Middle East at that time, under the Cold War conditions on NATO side, and as the bordering country, the borderline of NATO. Now, in 1960s, basically this changed, and the reason for the change was, I think, the foundation of the non-alignment movement, and the fact that Turkey was left very much alone in the Cyprus problem. So Turkey said we need to find some new allies, some countries that we could that could support us, and it started to raise its interest in the Middle East in the 2000s. But at that time, I would say from 1960s to the 2000s, Turkey was very much present in the region, despite the argument by some that Turkish engagement in the region started only after 2000. That's not true, very clearly so. Turkish engagement was there in the Middle East. Turkey was very much present, but Turkey was not as loud and as visible as after 2000s. Now, in the 2000s, the Turkish policy in the Middle East became very loud, very visible, very active, and quite ideologically motivated, especially in the period following 2010. Now, if you look at Turkey, how its presence flourished suddenly in the Middle East, just to summarize, I would say there were increased relations in trade and economic relations, and there was an institutional framework which was established with the region, and by that I mean the institutional framework established with the Arab League and the GCC, which is very important. Thirdly, Turkey set up this mechanism of strategic cooperation councils, which I think were very instrumental in developing relations with the countries in the region. Then there were these famous mediation efforts, and the most striking one was the mediation effort between Syria and Israel, and between different Palestinian factions, and I have been a part of both and more, and I can really say from, as an inside information, that these mediation efforts were not like smoke in the air. They meant something, but for different reasons, the result was as not hoped for. But these mediation efforts were really a very clear reflection of Turkish soft power in the region. Then there were the people-to-people relations, tourism, and Turkish soap operas, I think, which still are very effective in putting a Turkish image still, even today, in the Middle East. Now, all this started to crumble, and I think the breaking points were 2013 military coup d'etat in Egypt, which toppled President Morsi. The second one was Turkey's big advantage was to have good and balanced relations with Israel, between Israel and the Arab countries. Now, at one point, we lost this balance. I think Turkey lost this balance. When Israel was gone, this equation, which made up the balance, was disturbed very seriously. In the following period, the region became divided into two camps. On the one camp was Turkey and Qatar, and on the other camp was Egypt, Emirates, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, and others. Now, the defining character of these two different camps were pro-Muslim Brotherhood, anti-Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not sure if I agree with that really. I mean, that is probably a part of the making, but if you ask if this is entirely it, I would say no. Then Libya, of course, became the main battleground for these two camps. I'll not go into the details of that, but I think if we have perspective of a political solution in Libya, the major reason for that was Turkish involvement and its bringing balance to the Libyan conflict. Now, all these disputes and tensions, of course, these are not free. I mean, they are very costly in many ways, politically, economically, socially, and otherwise. So, these countries being countries of common sense at one point, they decided that fighting was not good in the end for neither side, and now we are seeing a period of rapprochement in the region. Turkey has been trying to make up, and vice versa, with several countries in the region. Some of them are going faster, some of them are slower, but at least the tension is diminished. I wouldn't say all the problems are solved, but then the tension is diminished, and that is a good say. Of course, then one can ask the question, if that is the case, and what has changed? Why did we have this tension for the last 7 years? That is a matter of another debate, I would say. Now, coming back to Syria, again, Jean-Pierre, I agree with almost everything you said, maybe entirely, some caveats here and there. Yes, King Faisal, French embassy was the palace of King Faisal, but before that, it was the palace of the Ottoman governor of Damascus, by the way. So it was first palace of Ottoman governor, then became the palace of Faisal, and then became the French embassy. To be very frank, whenever I went to this embassy later on, I always thought, you know, this should be the Turkish embassy. What can you do? But at least it's at the hands of a friendly country. So that's a good thing. Now, as to Syria, in Syria, which is the major conflict since the end of the Second World War, together with Bosnia, I think, things shifted after a point. I mean, the focus of attention was no longer bringing democracy to Syria, setting the Syrian people free, or giving their dignity back, or all those slogans. But there were two major points of focus, and one of them was Daesh or ISIS, whatever you want to call them, and the second one was the issue of Syrian refugees. Now the world forgot everything, almost everything, and concentrated all its efforts on these two major issues. Of course, here I'm not disregarding the humanitarian assistance and so on, but these were really minimal compared to the efforts put forward for combating Daesh and to prevent refugees crossing from Turkey into the European Union area. Now, both of these issues are somehow dealt with, but they are not out of the way. They still continue to top the agenda, and I think the threat of Daesh is very real still. It exists, and if you look at what's going on in Syria, if you follow what's going on in Syria, it's easily noticeable. You can see very clearly that they are very much there and they are very much organized. In any case, these terror organizations or these kinds of structure, they don't disappear, they don't go away. They mutate, like the COVID, in the pandemic, they mutate, they turn into something else, but they are always there. They have their logistical infrastructure, logistical, financial, and other infrastructure. They finish as being Daesh, they pop up as becoming something else, another name, but the ingredient and the structure is the same. Now, despite all we have said about Russia, Russia has a central role in Syria. And looking at the situation very realistically, I would say Russia is there to stay at this foreseeable future, but we don't know the scope of its role and effect in the coming years, but it will be present over there. And I don't think that the war in Ukraine will change that very much. The US is also present, but at a very limited scope. I mean, they have been partnering with, from our perspective, with the wrong partners over there. They are in Syria, but I think they have a deal or an understanding with the Russians, like they have a division of labor. I mean, who's going to do what? But they are present also. Now, Assad really survived, yes, thanks to the Russian support in terms of firepower and in terms of its role in the Security Council. It survived. But then, if you look at the country today, 40% of the territory is outside the control of Damascus, of Assad. The opposition is still there, it has not gone away, and 40% of the territories of Syria are outside his control, with military forces from 5 countries, at least 5 countries, present in the country. And the economic situation is terrible, terrible. So, can you call this a win? I'm not so sure, and I'm not even sure, actually, I would argue very much that the Syrian crisis is not over, and it will continue to be on the agenda for a long time, unless a realistic, sustainable political solution could be found. And I believe the political solution could be best found on the basis of 2254. But does Assad want that? No. For the very reasons that Jean-Pierre has underlined. First of all, this regime is willing to destroy the country in order to be able to survive. And really, that's the case. At the beginning of the crisis in 2011, I remember Rami Mahluf at the time, he said, if we are going to go, this country will go also. I mean, this is what he said, and he said we are ready for 1, 2, 3 million Syrians to die as long as the country remains intact. And when he says the country remains intact, he means the regime. I would like to give a very brief example on that. In Syria, the patria is understood as something else really. When the crisis started, the Syrians, the pro-Assad demonstrators, they came to our embassy, hundreds of them, thousands of them, and they started to climb the walls and so on, and we prevented them. We were in the embassy, all those things happened. But the important thing is one of the demonstrators, he climbed up the wall, he put a Syrian flag and a poster of Bashar Assad on the wall, and then he went down. Then one of our guys, he climbed the wall from inside, he took the flag and the poster down, and the crowd went crazy, and the police officer outside the walls, he said from the megaphone that we had, he said, please give us back the poster of Assad, and then we'll go, we'll make them go. So I said, okay, wait for 10 minutes and throw the poster out, and that's what we did. And they took the poster and they left. But nobody asked about the flag. You know, I think this gives a very clear impression of the perception in that. Anyhow, now this solution, and I also very much agree that Assad does not want the Syrians outside of the country back. I mean, suddenly 8 million people, and most of them either hardened opposition or people who do not sympathize with Assad at all, suddenly you will have 7-8 million of them. That's unthinkable. Plus, economically it's unfeasible. I mean, he's finding it difficult to feed the already existing millions, so how should he feed an extra 8 million? You know, there are many arguments for that. Now, on final word, now what's the solution to the problem? I would think that Assad and his regime are the problem itself. So you cannot solve the problem with the problem itself. There must be another solution, and that solution is 2254. Now, does that mean that Assad is, I mean, categorically the, I mean, must he go categorically? No. If according to the layout in 2254 could be implemented, and if somehow Assad is elected as a result of a real election, not like the one that he was elected before, then I think if that is the choice of the Syrian people, everybody, including us, you, and whoever, should respect it. But I don't think so. I mean, a fair and free elections would only bring the downfall of Bashar Assad over there. And yes, okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
We can go back to question and answer. So now we can come back to the audience for reactions, comments, feedback. We have ambassadors, scholars, students. Where is the microphone? Where is the mic? And what did which one?
Thank you very much. Very enlightening briefing we had. To both of you, I would like to ask something about Iran. Both of you did not mention Iran's position in Syria. I think it's an important subject to touch upon. Another one would be something about if you see any sort of a solution there. I want a small comment to remind you back in 1955, the Baghdad Pact, where Turkey again tried to do something in that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a very wonderful briefing that we had from both of you. And thank you, really, it was very enlightening. And I have just a question, right? Maybe following what Murat said to Jean-Pierre. There is, you have not mentioned the sectarian while in the Middle East. extensively. You have mentioned extensively, but not as the main, one of the main areas of conflict. And by saying that, I mean the Iranian influence on the whole scene. Iranians do carry a weight because the Shia, the minorities in all of the countries. And they control and they manipulate they want these minorities for their own benefit. And that's one of the reasons why the Gulf countries, the GC, the Gulf countries are very much feel the threat arising from the Iran. And they felt that the US would be a constant balance to it. So I would be very much happy if you could mention the sector. And that was wonderful. It was totally
Maybe we can come back to you at this point. If you want to respond.
Yes, with pleasure. And again, I want to thank Ömer for his nice word and say again how much we just proved in front of you how Turkish and French can not only look at the past together, but look at the future together. And I think that's very relevant. You know, as you may have noticed, I love the Syrian people. The whole Assad power structure is about not only raising the Syrian people per se, but about making it impossible to see the Syrian people. So you have several layers. You didn't mention the Israeli-Arab conflict. The Israeli-Arab conflict. Then the Shia-Sunni divide, then the Russian, but all this, from the point of view of the Assad regime, is purely tactical. The only key is that we all forget the Syrian people and his legitimate fight for self-determination. I insist on that. I insist on that because you don't have Shias in Syria. Only 1 or 2%, and they are not relevant politically or militarily. Alawites are not Shia. They were never Shia, and they will never be Shia, despite all the attempts by the Islamic Republic to Shiitize them. They are totally different from Shia. They are as different as, from Shia as Mormons are different from Protestants. They have their own. So the whole vision of, you know, the Islamic Republic is doing that because of Alawis being Shia is a big lie, and we should never buy this lie 1 second. That's very important. When did it start? It started in 1979 because the Assad regime, Assad father, and Khomeini had the same enemy, Saddam Hussein. This has nothing to do with sectarianism and everything to do with power politics in this part of the world. And then it evolved with Hezbollah and with the possibility that is now has been given to Iran by the United States of America through the invasion of Iraq in 2003 of having a territorial continuity from their territory to the Mediterranean. You know, if when the historians of the future will try to summarize in 2 lines the geopolitical results of the US invasion of Iraq, they will say that US gave an air cover to the Iranian ground penetration of Iraq and allowed them to dissolve the historical borders that had been established in 1639 between the Ottoman and the Safavid Empire. But this has nothing to do with sectarianism. Then you have regime who are literally feeding themselves on sectarian politics because they don't want politics. They want sectarianism as a negation of politics. So, you know, when I was telling you I was in Aleppo and when on the front line, I saw one of the day of the summer of 2013, a flag of Hezbollah. I was quite shocked. Now we all know that Hezbollah fought on the ground the war that the Assad army was not able to wage because of Hezbollah experience in urban warfare that the Syrian army, okay. So from then on, I have to admit that everybody in Aleppo was not saying Hezbollah, it was saying Hezb al-Shaitan, because, what were those people? So it was because they say we are defending the sites because it was a Mashhad where supposedly a drop of blood of Hussein had fallen when his head was taken from Karbala to Damascus. All those sites are historically debatable. What is interesting is how the Islamic Republic rebuilt the history and created around Sayyidah Zainab in Damascus, around many places, in fact, Iranian enclaves, with, of course, Shia justification, but basically as an outpost. What can say that the Russians now they have Hmeim and Latakia, while the Iranians have Sayyidah Zainab, they have Mashhad here, around the religious sites, so that they can train. And for them, there is no territorial, there is no solution of continuity. It's the same space from Hezbollah, Lebanon to Iraq. And it's the same Iraqi militias, Harakat al-Nujaba, that were used during the Battle of Aleppo. And when Ali Akbar Velayati, after the fall of Aleppo in 2016, went to praise, one has to remember that it was the first time since the 6th century that a Persian power could be in Aleppo, pre-Islam. So this has very little to do with Islam and of course with Shiism that happened only centuries later. So I hope I addressed your concerns and answered rightfully to your very important question.
Would you like to also respond to the same?
Yes, thank you. I think the role of Iran is really very important. It's one of the central roles, and it was one of the elements that I referred to at the beginning. And now I think Iran, very shortly, Iran is in Syria for several reasons. Now, one of them is self-defense, because Iran believes that the real target is itself, and it has established this line of defense in Syria. So that is the first thing. The second thing is the preservation of the Shia belt, which extends from Iran to Iraq, Syria, then to Lebanon, where Hizb al-Shaitan is based. That is the second thing. And the third thing, of course, is the protection of Shia holy sites in Iran. As you said, the population, the Shia in Syria, the Shia population in Syria is only about 1–2%, but there was a very active and structured Shiaization policy of the Iranians. I mean, that was a big problem between Iran and Syria before the war in 2000 or the crisis in 2011 started. And now we can see that Iran has really put all its weight on this issue. Now today, east of Aleppo or east of Euphrates is at the hands of Syrian Democratic Forces, but in reality, the YPG, and the other dominant power over there is Iran. I mean, Iran is very active among the tribes. For example, I won't name it here, but one of the most prominent and strong tribes in Syria, which is in the Deir Zor area, was on the side of opposition, and he was here in Istanbul. Then suddenly he went back and he joined the regime, and now he is the strongest and most active Shia militia in that area. Now Iran is very active over there. The area between Palmyra and Abu Kemal is almost Iranistan, Shiistan. So even though I agree with the fact that the Shia make a small percentage of the population in Syria, Iran is playing on them and they are increasing in numbers. Hezbollah was active and in Syria from day one. We went from day one. We went to this village, town rather, north of Syria near the Turkish border, where the opposition raided the town and they had a battle with the government forces. And then when they withdrew, government came back and they took us as ambassadors to give us a tour of the area. And I saw with my own eyes these yellow Hezbollah flag jeeps and military vehicles circling the town. And the third and the last thing, of course, is the holy places. I mean, now the protection of all these holy places, and to begin with Sayyida Zeynep, is under the protection of Shias and Iranian Revolutionary Guard. I mean, these are really facts on the ground. Thank you. And on Idlib, I would say the situation in Idlib is very delicate, of course, and very sensitive. But I don't think that is a problem which can be solved by itself. It should be a part of a package of solution in the future, if ever.
We have a couple of more questions. Let's start with Selim. He already got the mic.
Okay. This is Filiu. I'm a PhD student from Technology University. I want to take the concerns from the Iran and Russia to the Israel and Turkish policy over the Syria. Because from my point of view, the Syria and Turkey has similar policies, foreign policy over the Syrian territory. Israel had already invaded a part of territory on Syria, the Golan Heights, and Turkey controlled the border line and passed the border line and got operations over the Syrian territories. So do you see any similarities between the Turkish and Israeli foreign policy over Syria? Because they have actually already same historical background, same historical aggression to the Syria. Can you define these similarities between Israel and Turkey or territory?
Thank you. Next, we have a French fellow here, I guess.
Thank you for your inspiring speeches. I'm Ömer. I'm a graduate student at Political Science and International Relations. I want to ask you both that you both pointed out that Bashar Assad has to destroy the country for its own survival regime, and the biggest supporter of him is Russia, currently, the Ukrainian crisis and its consequences are quite unforeseen. And I want to ask that, can we expect a radical change in the situation of the Syrian crisis in terms of the Ukrainian crisis find an end? Thank you.
Numan, sizde...
Professor Filiu, could you please elaborate on the possible joint and political role of the European Union on Syria? Is it only interested in the global refugees, or the European Union can have a possible large role to play in the Syrian situation?
Yes.
I would like to ask how much, to which extent it is possible to dissociate the crisis in Syria from the one in Lebanon, looking at the current situation there, and how much nuclear development and gas exploration or something else would lead to solve the crisis in the region.
Could you introduce yourself as well?
I mean, for the discussion, I was associate in Paris, in Sciences Po Paris. Yes.
Thank you. We can come back to you if you want this time. We start with you.
Thank you. Well, yes, Israel and Turkey, we can make a list of issues which may look similar in terms of security threats emanating from Syria. There are quite a number of similarities, but I think we don't need to go into that. But I would say in brief that the two countries, both Israel and Turkey, would feel secure if there is a permanent and sustainable solution in Syria. Unless there is that, both countries will continue to feel very much vulnerable to threats coming from Syrian territories. Now, yes, as we both said, I think, for the regime, what is important is their own preservation, I mean self-preservation, and in order to preserve themselves and in order to hold power, they are ready to sacrifice so many things. I mean, they already sacrificed 8 million Syrians who live outside of Syria. They already sacrificed about 53% of all buildings and infrastructure in Syria, which is either totally destroyed or not inhabitable anymore. They already sacrificed over 500,000 Syrians who are under the ground now, not with us anymore. So they sacrificed many things for their own sakes, and they sacrificed, by the way, close to 40% of their territory now, which is not under their control. So there is no end, I think, to what they could sacrifice. I mean, I cannot really remember another country using chemical weapons against its own people. So I think that by itself says something. The Ukraine crisis, yes, it will have quite a number of effects, I think, on Syria and the region as a whole, but will it be decisive in terms of bringing the crisis to an end in Syria? I don't think so. On Syria-Lebanon relations, I think Lebanon is very much and has always been like that, affected from developments in Syria. Today, I think 1 in every 4 people living in Lebanon is Syrian. Lebanon has its own problems, and a good percentage of these problems again emanate from the crisis in Syria. But it has always been like that. I mean, it's not something special to this time crisis. So Lebanon will continue to be affected. I think what I said for Turkey and Israel is also applicable for Lebanon and Jordan also. Thank you.
Thank you. Jean-Pierre.
Yes. So first, I will start where Ömer just ended with Syria and Lebanon. Ömer reminded us that Hezbollah has been part of the Syrian crisis from day one, which means that despite the Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon in 2005 under popular pressure, the two countries constitute the same military scene. And Hezbollah gained an incredible military experience through the fighting in Syria that is now quite feared from the Israeli side, because it's a much stronger militia than it was before. One can even consider that Hezbollah is today the strongest Arab army in the region because of the Syrian experience. What Assad did through war, Hezbollah and the corrupt political class in Lebanon did it through organized bankruptcy. But the result is the same. You kick out the middle class, you force critical voices to flee the country, you give them no future, and so that you preserve the sectarian system of power. And any outbreak in gas or pipelines or I don't know what will not change anything as long as the power structure in Lebanon is so connected to the power structure in Syria. You know, from time to time, Bashar al-Assad at this moment of candor, at the beginning of the fall down of the downfall, sorry, well, in fact, of the crumbling of the Lebanese financial system, he said, "Oh, I lost I don't know how many billions of Syrian pounds in the Lebanese bank because it's so connected. You know, there's no Syrian pound without Lebanese pound, and vice versa. With the Beka, which is, by the way, Hezbollah land, serving as a laundering machine for capitals on both sides. There is one significant difference between Israel and Turkey when it comes to Bashar al-Assad, is that Israel consistently bet on Bashar al-Assad remaining in power, considering it was the worst of all evils from their point of view. After all, Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad had kept the Golanites quiet for 2 generations. So there was another difference, if I may say, which is that Israel bet on Putin to curb Iranian influence in Syria, which was, I think, a very myopic vision, and it turns out, you know, I wrote a political biography of Netanyahu, that one day in a security cabinet meeting, Netanyahu say, "Oh, Putin lied to me," and Lieberman just started to laugh because, of course, he lied to you. His name is Putin. He was not going, of course. And every time they say, yes, we're going to take care of the Iranians, the Israelis discovered that Russia was doing nothing, and they're starting not only taking the matter in their own hand, but changing the doctrine of claiming strikes, while before they were bombing without saying, so now we see repeated strikes targeting Iranian position and sometimes killing Iranian officials with retaliation in Iraq, which proves that all this is quite an integrated battlefield. About European Union, fortunately, hasn't yet pulled out its paycheck, fortunately, because the spontaneous, okay, in the Middle East, what could we pay? What could we pay? Oh, we're ready to pay. We're ready to finance a bankrupt Palestinian Authority. We're ready to. No, fortunately, Europe hasn't done that. Hasn't done that because even the least interested people know that it will serve nothing. That all this money will fall into Assad bottomless bucket, and no refugee will come because, as Ömer reminded very relevantly, he did all this for those people to stay out, so he won't invite them in. But certainly in the, I wouldn't say in the long run, but in the mid run, there is a possibility, because all the elements of a solution are there. Syria cannot be rebuilt without the refugees, and the refugees cannot come back if Assad stays in power. But if, you know, this the planets align in a different way, you have all the resources, because Syrians are very patriotic. I am in contact with Syrians from all walks of life, from all origins, everywhere, in France, in Europe, in the Middle East. They all want to contribute to the reconstruction of their country. But of course, they will do nothing with Assad staying in power. But when the time comes, Europe could play a very significant role in rebuilding Syria through the popular will. And what about Ukraine? Well, I just noticed, I'm not very bright, I'm a historian, I'm about chronology, that Minister Shoigu visited Bashar al-Assad 10 days before the invasion of Ukraine. I don't think he shared this plan with Bashar, but certainly the Russians wanted to be sure that everything was under control in Syria before launching this unprecedented invasion of Ukraine. So I do believe, and we saw that with the connection between the gas bombings and the annexation of Crimea, that from the point of view of the Russian military staff, there is a connection between the two theaters. It's not independent theaters. Middle East and Europe is an integrated one, and one should not be surprised if at one moment or another, the development of the Ukrainian crisis have repercussions in the Middle East through Russian military choice.
Ömer, you want to
Can I just add something very brief? It was in my notes, but I forgot to say it. You reminded me of it. Another conflict that we are facing today in Syria is the one between Russia and Iran, actually. I mean, they are on the boat, they are on the same side, but then from under the table, they are kicking each other very hard. For example, if you look at what happened in Dara last summer, this was entirely a result of this conflict between the Russians and Iranians, and they both are in a race of establishing their own military units or establishing military units with loyalties to themselves. And I think Russia is also collaborating with Israel in Israel's targeting Iranians in Syria. By the way, it's a very nice thing for Israel to have Iranians so close, because it doesn't go into the trouble of traveling a far distance, but it's only a few miles from their position. So Russians are facilitating this. I mean, Russia has the control of the airspace of Syria, and without Russian permission, I would say, it's impossible for anybody to fly over that airspace. But then Israelis find it very convenient and very comfortable to pick the Iranian targets in this country.
I think actually I was going to raise, but for the sake of time, I didn't. From the very beginning, there was also a discussion about to what extent whether Iran or Russia penetrated into the Syrian regime, who exerts a greater control. This has been also an open question. Good that you also raised it, but of course, we should also remember that Netanyahu was not the only one Putin lied to, and President Macron also tried to mediate in the Ukraine crisis several times, but it turns out that he may have been lying to the other leaders than Netanyahu as well. I guess we had a wonderful event, and we are finishing up our event at this point because our time is up. Our online channels have reached their limits. I thank you all for your attendance, and the event will also be available through our YouTube channel for those of you who want to listen later, and we will keep you posted about our future events in hybrid or physical or online format, whatever it is. And I also thank both speakers for this candid assessment and frank discussion, and I wish everybody a very good